I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 6 in the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan, here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. We have folks in British Columbia, the Maritimes, and where's Candace? Also, well, BC as well. So thanks for joining us today. And before we get into sort of the webinar with our panelists, I want to set the context of how this sort of came about. Back in 2019, we did a very deep engagement exercise. Mitacs and Indigenous Works undertook a really deep engagement exercise with 500 Canadians. We did a forum in Vancouver in June of 2019, then we went to Wakefield in August, and then we all went to Fredericton at our national event, Inclusion Works. And we really were looking at this engagement gap and how do we connect academia, the research agenda, and we learned a lot. I mean, some of the things that we learned is I think there were sort of three key messages that I would relay is we heard nothing about us without us. That the day has come, no more research about us without us. We heard from people that we need to develop new infrastructures that will support Indigenous research because it's not there right now. We heard that we need to be able to address Indigenous needs and priorities. We also heard internally, there was people inside Mitacs, and I always think of Rita Benrod, who was so moved by what he learned and went through this whole experience. And he said, the lack of engagement is a factor why Indigenous people are not taking part in the types of programs that we have, and we need to establish trust. We need to show benefit to the communities. And we must establish and support new Indigenous-led infrastructures so that we can engage with communities. So all in all, folks, it's really about developing a new and exciting ecosystem. And after that year of engagement, we continued to do work. Our friends at Mitacs expanded their work. They brought on some great talent like Candace Loring, who you're going to meet in a second here. And they brought on and expanded this work, and you're going to hear about some of the trajectories that are taking place. And there'll be an invitation for you to see how you can get your community, your Indigenous business, or your Indigenous organization engaged and involved in these different research programs that will be available to you. So with that sort of setting the context there, I want to introduce to you the people that are on the screen with me. I'm going to start by introducing Andrea Reid. She is an Indigenous fisheries scientist and conservationist biologist, and she's going to be a new assistant professor at the University of BC's Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. And guess what? She's literally starting next month. She's actually already underway, but officially January 2021. Her program adopts interdisciplinary and applied approaches to improving and understanding the complex relationships between fish, people, and place. She belongs to the Nisga's Nation on British Columbia's north coast, and she's got a significant experience with Indigenous fisheries, their communities, their practices, perspectives, as well as she's got worldviews and experience with countries like East Africa, Oceania, Southeast Asia, and New Zealand. She's a Governor General's Gold Medalist recipient. She earned her PhD in biology from Carleton University in 2020, and using tools and insights from both Western and Indigenous sciences, which is what Albert Marshall talks about when he talks about two-eyed seeing. She's living and dreaming that by looking at, and you're going to hear about these multiple stressors in the Pacific on the salmon, and hear about some of the new thinking that she's bringing to this work. She's also a National Geographic Explorer and a fellow of the Explorers Club. I expect to see you in the Antarctica one day, Andrea. I now want to introduce Chris Gugu. Chris is the president of Ulnooweg. And Ulnooweg is a Mi'kmaq word which means to make Indigenous or adapt beliefs or customs of the Mi'kmaq. Chris is a proud member of the Wakefield First Nation, living in Millbrook and with his wife and 3 children. He's been a leader, he has been an innovator, he has been a personal friend, And since 2000, he's helped spawn hundreds of Aboriginal entrepreneurs secure their loans, develop their businesses and opportunities. And in this way, Ulnooweg is really operating as an extension of the communities, looking at how to cater and develop unique needs and really supporting the business entrepreneurs. But they've also led the development of some really, really cool initiatives that you're going to hear about. And you're going to hear about their work. And what Chris is going to be able to do in this presentation is Andrea is going to talk about more of the process and the design, getting ready for. Good. Is that a signal to me? Andrea's going to be able to talk about more of the design, the scoping, and the process towards the work with research and a Mitacs project. And Chris is going to be able to talk about 5 or 6 or 7 of their initiatives and how they could get positioned and where they see some opportunities for research, student researchers to come in and actually take them to the next level with a research agenda. So welcome to you, Chris. I also want to introduce Candace Loring. And Candace is a proud member of the Gitwangak. How's that for pronounce it? The Gitwangak from the Gitxsan Nation in BC. She's passionate about economic development in Indigenous communities, which led to her pursuing a degree in business management with a minor in psychology from the University of British Columbia in the Okanagan. She draws on extensive experience working in the finance sector. She now applies that and brings that expertise in finance, community relations, business development, and Indigenous engagement to the work at Mitacs. She says her greatest accomplishment is raising her 2 boys, Jonah and Caleb. And she has really helped leapfrog Mitacs forward on this journey of Indigenous engagement. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the folks that we have today. And what we're going to do is I'm going to start with Andrea. And Andrea, if you could just describe for the audience, give an overview of this initiative that you're undertaking, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kelly, for the kind introduction and the welcome. I really appreciate it. So, meet Amwala. Hello, how are you, everyone? It's great to be here with you all. I'm joining currently from the territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish peoples in Vancouver, British Columbia, where, as Kelly said, I'm about to take up a faculty position at the University of British Columbia, starting in just a few weeks. So excited to get that going. And before I've even begun, I've been really fortunate that I'm beginning this group that centers on Indigenous fisheries at UBC, and I've already been approached by a number of phenomenal Indigenous students eager to work in this space. And so I'm delighted to start carving projects out with these students and get things rolling. But this project is actually the brainchild, the idea of the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund, which is a partnership of 6 First Nations in the Lower Fraser River. And these groups have recognized a need to bring Indigenous values and Indigenous voices into the fore of how we look at aquatic ecosystems and assess their health. There's this really neat concept that the Maori have developed called the Cultural Health Index, which is what the Maori have used to bring Maori voices and values into assessing aquatic health in that part of the world. And the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund would like to bring that kind of thinking here to BC. And so they approached myself and my eager students to get working on this to begin working on this project. And so we actually just submitted our first Mitacs application just yesterday, and we're very much in the design and development phase. So I'm happy to share more, but that's the big picture idea, Kelly.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll come back to the process of getting to that point, which is, I know it's a lot of work, but it's an exciting part of the journey is the design, the process, because once you get to the stage of actually submitting it to Mitacs, is almost fait accompli in the sense that the folks there help work with you to ensure that your projects are going to be funded and successful. So we'll come back. Chris, over to you. If you could, I want to do this in 2 parts, Chris, because we've got viewers and listeners from across Canada. And Ulnooweg is doing so many things, from areas of STEM, Windhorse farms, the marine area, food security initiatives, the fisheries with Clearwater. So I think the first part, if you can just describe Ulnooweg, its range of services and activities that it has underway. And then I'm going to go back to Andrea, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the research trajectory. But if you can just give an overview of Ulnooweg first, please, so they can see just the depth of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So just a little correction on my introduction there. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Ulnooweg, and our CEO is actually Todd Hoskin. So just wanted to make that correction. Ulnooweg's an organization that started back in 1985. It's we're doing our 35th anniversary now. We had a celebration just about a little less than maybe 3 weeks ago. But during that time, during its inception, the community was, of course, dealing with the resurgence of the 60 scoop population, I guess you would say that, and kids coming back to find their cultures and their identity. And what led then was a gathering at Liscombe Lodge in Nova Scotia, which brought together community members from here and across nationally as well, experts in sociology and economics, which led then to Ulnooweg and a sister organization, Micmac Family Services. And Ulnooweg was given a very broad mandate at the time, but it included economic and social welfare, included training and research, and it also included philanthropy. In the first 20 years as an organization, it focused on, I wouldn't say it was a choice of ours, let's just say that. Our funding pigeonholed, and that's an important point. Our funding pigeonholed us kind of in the economic business development side of it. And so we did that for the first 20 years. And eventually we went through some ups and downs, of course, like any other organization, and we strengthened ourselves. But that strengthening then allowed us to go into other areas like broader community economic development stuff. And this is where we started addressing some of those kind of needs that the community saw back in 35 years ago, which led in 2013 the creation of the Ulnooweg, at the time, the Ulnooweg Financial Education Center, focusing on governance, financial literacy for First Nation governments. And then 2 years ago, we launched our the Ulnooweg Indigenous Communities Foundation, our own public foundation, which is for all of the Indigenous communities in Atlantic Canada. So those three organizations now fulfill the original mandate that we were given 35 years ago. So we've come full circle into, over our history there. And from that three organizations, we do business loans, like in the past 35 years, over 75 million. We do economic development for communities and create North Source revenues for them. Like I said, we now help them with their financial literacy. We support them in building partnerships with private sector, research institutions. We work in the area of education now and training, where we started out doing work in STEM with Digital Mi'kmaq, linking up with other private sector partnerships as well there, and public partnerships there. And in philanthropy, we've been doing stuff naturally as an Indigenous organization in the world of philanthropy, but this 2 years ago with our launch, it gave us kind of the infrastructure to do that. So we've supported building the infrastructure for the communities in philanthropy, getting them basically registered as qualified donees, which has allowed those flow of funds to go into the communities and act as a portal. And that has led us to education, led us to addressing food security and sovereignty at not just a personal level, but at a community nation level as well. So yeah, that's basically a high-level summary of the organization.
You know, that your organizational structure is one that's pretty amazing. And you know, 35 years old, you guys are like an elder in organizational development. It's really, I mean, so much. How many organizations can? So I mean, good for the Mi'kmaq again to sort of be leading the way. I want you to now give a bit of insights on some of the STEM and things like the Windhorse farms and the security and food security initiatives. Give us a little insights into that, because that will set the stage for the next section, which is looking at the research in those areas. But just describe those, because they're very, very exciting initiatives.
Yeah, so like I said, we started as an organization in business and economic development, mainly in London. So a few years ago, Canada came out with a program called CanCode, and it was pretty much in line with what we were trying to do was increase opportunities in the space of innovation in the ecosystem, you know, and for us at the time, it was going into those spaces as me being an Indigenous person, being the only Indigenous person that would end up in those circles. And you're talking about not 5 or 6, one amongst 5 or 6, one amongst hundreds, right? And you didn't see, as I didn't see any of our people in there, any of our leadership or any of our leadership invited, any of our educators, any of our leaders in the education aspect in terms of like our directors, our principals. We didn't see any of that. So that was a major concern for us. And we, you know, while at the same time, where we're trying to create entrepreneurs and we're trying to get communities in going into larger organizations, more complex businesses. With that complexity comes a need for a demand for higher paying jobs, higher quality of employees, more, you're looking at technicians and, master's requirements there. So okay, then we said, okay, well, we got about maybe 5 years to address that. So it would take about 5 years to get these companies rolling and really get ownership at a level where we need our people in those in those jobs. So we didn't take the 5-year approach, of course. We took the 10 to 15 year approach. And this is where the Digital Mi'kmaq program grew out of, was increase in kind of the exposure of STEM with students between K to 12. So that's where we're at. We partnered with the likes of Canadian Space Agency in robotics, that houses Big Data Analytics Department for big data, the Mila in AI out in Montreal, and creating education modules for artificial intelligence, 3D tech modeling, so this was big stuff that wasn't part of public education at all, right? If you wanted to go into those areas, it was more something that you would go into at a university level. But we knew our kids could, would find interest. And this is where my wife's a teacher by trade and 25 years experience. So she's always talked to me about the lack of engagement in students and how we learn differently as Indigenous kids, right? And so this was an opportunity for us to create something different. And so we got our facilitators and creating these modules and going into the schools and teaching about big data, teaching about robotics. And we had the Canadian Space Agency go live into those discussions, into those classrooms in the same spaces that astronauts would have trained, and our highlight for that, and when we started, was actually partnering with the Canadian Space Agency and Davis and Jacques taking a miniature basket and an eagle feather, a small eagle feather up into space, into the International Space Station. So the kids got to see that as well, right? And creating those reinvigorating those aspirations that they originally had when they were young, and then went through the education system beating them down, right? But now you're lighting that fire back into them.
Wow.
The other is the Windhorse farm, is that our financial education center was realizing that we needed those kind of land based education as well, was having those safe spaces for our kids to bring it up, the two-eyed seeing approach, and where they could have a space where they can talk about Indigenous knowledge and science, and bringing them together on two-eyed seeing, and Indigenous knowledge being science, really, bringing those two together by realizing the power of our people's stories. And Windhorse is roughly about 200 acres, about 100 of it is ancient forest. So you're talking about pre-colonial forest that existed when the settlers came here. So when we go back, imagine what the aspirations were of our people back then. Imagine again, even the aspirations of the settlers back then, coming from, worlds of tyranny and stuff, and how those relationships started and really began. So this is what we want to create, is those safe spaces, even for safe spaces for our elders to be able to speak and tell those stories that's deep down within them. So those are two just exciting projects for us that we do.
And I appreciate you setting the context, because I'm going to come back to you. And now we're going to look at where do we take off on a research trajectory. And it all starts with process and design. So Andrea, if you can describe some steps that you took around process, design, the relationship building towards this initiative, could you describe that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, thanks for your words. It's so neat to hear about these projects. And yeah, I really appreciate the way that you're embracing two-eyed seeing. And I think that's a big part of the work that we're trying to do through this project and other initiatives that I'm undertaking, that, like you said, like our publication or our public education system has been so centered on one way of knowing without much space for others. And we really need ways to amplify Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of learning for youth, and even all the way up to the level learners who still are in predominantly Western dominated systems. So this project is really centered on bringing that kind of thinking of, there's a really good quote by Clicho Chief Jimmy Bruno about making youth strong like two people, about learning from multiple ways of knowing and having kind of those skills and toolkits from both Western science and Indigenous science. And so the process and design that's gone into this project is really, I mean, it's all about Indigenous-led research. This was a need identified by these communities and by this organization, the First Nations Fisheries Legacy Fund. And they approached me, and this is really the way that I do work and how I want to operate at UBC, and change what has been a really historically colonial approach to research, of researchers parachuting into communities and saying what it is that they need to do, and maybe not even making community members aware of why they're there or what they're doing. And so that really needs to flip on its head completely. And ultimately, we need to decolonize the research process. And that really comes down to more than talk, but really action. And so a lot of what this research project is centering on is, how do we build up these toolkits that allow us to look at aquatic ecosystem health? How do we look at the health of our waterways through both lenses? How do we bring together these tools from Western science that can be hugely beneficial to how we understand the world around us, but also have this space for Indigenous knowledge systems to inform that too? And so we're centering this work on sites of particular importance to these communities, working with them through workshops and interviews to identify what key locations are and how they want to go about this work. So it's really about being responsive. And Kelly, you put it well at the beginning of, it's really about like not having, I guess, nothing about us without us. And that really is the mantra of my group moving forward. And relationship building, I guess, just the importance of that, it can't be overstated. That is so fundamental to doing this work in the right way. It requires there being trust. And I've been really fortunate that these communities thought that I was an appropriate person to come to, that we can, break down those barriers and walls between communities and the university and start to build these strong collaborations and bring together those skill sets on problems that our community identified. But we're very much on the front end, as I mentioned. And so right now we're at the stage of, several months of coming together and having these meetings and crafting what we want to do together. But the next months ahead will kind of build on that framework that we've put in place and continue to define how we want to move through this work together. And I'm really excited for these next steps and getting these youth out in the field to be doing some of this work in some of our key watersheds in the Fraser River.
Andrew, let me ask you, one of the things that I hear, and by the way, I think we all get guided to these challenges for a reason, so I think you obviously are a perfect fit for this. Here's one of the things you said is that you've looked at the cultural health index from New Zealand.
Yeah.
And so often I hear this, everything, it has to be community based and community driven. And I say, yes, but people misunderstand it. Indigenous people also look around the world. They want to see what are some of the best practices, what are some of the things that they're doing. And the fact that you said you want to actually adopt that index, you'll respect that index, but look at how to adapt it in the Canadian or the BC context. I thought this is an amazing part of it. Just tell us how that came about.
This was very much from the community, from the group of nations that make up the Legacy Fund, something that they identified as a key thing to do. And what we're going to work towards through this project is develop a toolkit and a framework that can be applied to other contexts. So, we all know Indigenous communities are not all one and the same, and contexts vary a great deal. And so what Indigenous values look like in one place are going to differ greatly from another, potentially. There might be some similarities for sure, but we're going to kind of craft out these key steps so that other nations in BC, but also across Canada or other parts of the world, can also take up this kind of call to action to amplify Indigenous voices in monitoring our waterways. We all depend so greatly on healthy aquatic ecosystems. And we know that in Canada, we have a really big problem around healthy waterways and good, clean drinking water for communities in this country. And so this is working towards positioning communities and positioning youth to be equipped to be monitors, to be guardians and water protectors ultimately.
What I like where you're going is at the root of respect, one of the roots is reciprocity. And so you're learning from the Maori. This will be a new toolkit with on a new framework, a new index, and then you'll share it back with the Maori. And in that way, that's really knowledge mobilization, creating new knowledge and transferring knowledge. Chris, I want to now go to you. Man, look. You guys, big data, robotics, artificial intelligence, you are really plowing and leading the way. Where do you see now, in the same way that Andrea's had to go on a process to bring this research agenda along, where do you see the research needs and sort of the research process steps that you folks want to take?
So with the digital magma, research was kind of our one thing that we wanted to make sure to capture from the start. So acquiring that baseline data of again, going back to kids and what their aspirations are, simple questions like, what do you want to be when you want to grow up? And do you like mathematics? Do you like science? Do you like biology? Stuff like that, questions like that. So creating that baseline data and maybe after 5 years, asking the same questions. And but within those 5 years, you've created an environment where you've exposed them to all these great things in science, where public education wouldn't have exposed them to necessarily, but even the outside ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem, they wouldn't have been exposed to that because of the barriers that we have. Right, the distance, the transportation fees, all that stuff. So we've brought that into the communities, And so we were lucky to start our research in that area with a professor named Ismail Morphy. I think that's his last name. Out of, at the time, University of Toronto, Department of Economics. And Ismail's research actually started in STEM with looking at how women are compared to men in pursuing careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. And what there were a lot of assumptions that men want to go into those more than women. And he broke that. He just, ripped that apart basically from his research. So that partnership was created with Ismail along with Boriana out of University of Toronto as well, and trying to kind of replicate the same study with our people that, there might be assumptions that Indigenous people aren't interested in STEM as well. We're proving that live that they're not. Right, there are kids there that are looking at using robotics in ways in coding that I've never done before in my life, right? And you get, like I said, you get to learn that stuff in university. So that's one area. And with Windhorse was also in research in that we do say that as an example, our Indigenous ways of knowing and being a healthy person is really rooted in our land, rooted in our we call it Gizuk, our creator, Mother Earth, and how that really creates this sense of a healthy living. When you combine, you're not only immersing people in education and science, but you're actually immersing them in their natural environment. And on top of that, immersing them in technology, right? So the immersion of the environment is more important, and that for us, we want to measure that in a way that, and it could be as simple as, once you started going into the woods, and the Japanese have this notion you don't bathe yourself in water, but you bathe yourself in forest. And that's kind of the same notion that we've had, right? You go into the forest and express your emotions to all our relations, what's the word I'm looking for? Norma, or Imsid Norma, and you talk to your elders through the forest, and they're there. So that's the things that we want to research on. The other part is getting them involved in research and innovation aspect, where I've been involved. I'm lucky to be involved in Novacorp as an example, where we're looking at startup technologies, being exposed to technologies from the very start, where they're researching ideas and concept and going into commercialization and stuff. You're talking about commercializing new innovations in agriculture, in ocean tech, especially in ocean supercluster here, carbon capture, desalination. All that stuff, that whole process, our people can be involved in that, especially when it comes to nature, right? They can be involved in that. It doesn't necessarily have to be researching our people, but researching the environment. And that occurs in the commercial space. And it's a huge space. That's where everything starts. And it usually links with universities. And I see a really great opportunity there where people, not necessarily at a graduate level, but even an undergraduate, that can get involved to see that process and spark their interest in those fields to go forward, and even to spark their entrepreneurial kind of spirits in the possibilities of their ideas might be commercialized. So that's the whole breadth that I see of it.
Tremendous. Leadership is about seeing where we need to go. And Chris, you're a leader, because although you and I are the actual guys that would do that kind of research, there's very, very sharp people like Andrea Reid, Dr. Andrea Reid. And Candace, I'm going to go to you. I wanted to get Candace to give some other examples, folks. There are some student researchers doing some amazing things. And like I said, it's been a real engagement exercise and a real trajectory growth. But there's people like, Candace, I think of Melissa Tremblay. I think of people like Taylor Jameson. If you could just describe for us the work that they're doing and their initiatives, please.
Well, thank you so much. I want to first start by introducing myself. So, Wachasrahal is Candace Kuntel Hazelton, and Clachaclahap Tui, Deborah Nash, Robert Cassisia, Lisquascasia, Jonah Nash, Caleb. And the reason that it's important to me to introduce myself in Inseelchsen is for one, that it's honoring the place in which I live, the unceded ancestral territory of the Syilx people. But I introduced my parents and where I come from with an eye to the past. And I also introduced who my children are with an eye to the future. So in everything that we do, we always have to keep that in mind of understanding where we have come and where we're going when it comes to research. And Mitacs understands that historically research was done on Indigenous people and not for and with Indigenous people. And as you said, we're committed to changing that narrative to nothing about us without us. And I think those words are really powerful, you know, and referring back to those 3 cross-country consultations where we listened and we took time to learn. Now we're in a phase where we're taking real changes and making systemic changes within our organization. At Mitacs, we don't see this Indigenous strategy as a market segment, rather an organizational shift. So I just wanted to lay that groundwork to understand how we can have these amazing projects, because when people hear the word research, it carries a lot of weight with it. There's a lot of stigma that comes with that word, because for far too long, researchers have been going into Indigenous communities and pushing research agendas and taxing these communities. And the very model at Mitacs is an innovation pull model. So the communities, the Indigenous organizations are the one defining the scope of these research projects. So we're not pushing research agendas, rather the communities are pulling and saying, we have a need, how can you support us? And that's where we can come in and create these incredible projects. So a few of the projects that you just named off, you know, the one with Melissa, it's an incredible project where she worked with family housing, helping young families stay together. So when a young mother, it wasn't geared towards just Indigenous families, although a majority of the families she worked with were Indigenous. Melissa Tremblay herself is of Métis descent and was doing her PhD at University of Alberta. But to be able to create holistic wraparound support services, bringing in culture, bringing in elders, and having that support for these young mothers to help them stay with their families who might have otherwise been torn apart. You know, these are the types of projects that we can get involved in that have real social impact that can change communities. Another example would be language revitalization. I think people think of research and have just a STEM focus, but we can work with all disciplines. Some of the proudest projects that I have are ones where we're actually legitimizing Indigenous ways of knowing, where the researchers have self-determination within that research. So a great project we did with the Quill Development Corporation out of Penticton with the Okanagan Indian Band was a language house. We know that there's so much culture held in the language, and as our elders are passing that language and that culture is going with them. So this movement of language revitalization and our youth learning the language, that's the types of projects that Mitacs can help support and make those connections. You know, we had a great project also up with the Chicho Environmental this last year, and it was working with GIS mapping systems, but incorporating traditional Indigenous ecological ways of knowing into the GIS mapping, as well as cultural places of significance, and looking at the caribou migration patterns. So when resource companies are coming in, the communities can make more informed decisions when it comes to resource extraction. But on the other hand of that, they can also show what the use of this traditional territory is to stop extraction or projects within their community. So it's just about supporting. So if a community needs that help tapping into post-secondary institution talent, that's where we can come in and be that bridge between academia and industry. I call myself a professional matchmaker, but I'm not matchmaking for love. I matchmake for research and innovation. So it's a pretty cool job.
It's a different kind of love. I love it. It's,
Is it?
you
And I
know,
love
Candace, folks, I can see that some of you have started to use the Q&A function. So the question function. So please type in your questions. I'm going to go to those, but what you've heard so far today, Andrea talks about their work in the fisheries, developing this new and toolkit and engagement framework, this index, and really about the process of getting there, and now the process of launching and moving forward. Chris has identified a forward-looking picture where and how research has been part of Indigenous thinking for thousands of years, and now we're just bringing it back, putting it into practice with some real-time activities and initiatives around robotics, around big data, and even combining things like a forest, which is looking at the cultural, spiritual, emotional, intellectual side of development. I was laughing, folks. I got to tell you, I said to Chris one time, I said, "Oh, you're bringing STEM into the classroom. Are you going to bring a few trees?" He said, "Hell no, we're going to buy a whole forest." And they did, 200 acres, traditional forest. Half of that has never been touched. I think it's just such a great example of a new kind of living laboratory and classroom for Canada. And Candace, I think those examples, I wanted the audience to see just the range from social, medical, other types of humanity things that are being supported. And you could argue that that's really about, if you're thinking about employment, it's about well-being, a healthy workforce, healthy students, healthy communities. And so I think some of these things, there is always a dotted line between curing cancer, language revitalization, these types of initiatives, healthy places for our children to grow in homes, like the work Melissa was doing. That is what we mean by well-being. You can't be a functioning, healthy contributor in the workforce if you're not healthy in all those ways. So the beauty is it has the flexibility, folks. It has the flexibility to draw on many, many different disciplines, and you can move forward. So I'm now going to, just so you all know, what we're going to do is I'm going to go to the Q&A. There are some questions. I'll answer. I'll be redirecting them. In some cases, they might be even questions for our Mitacs admin folks. And then Candace, I'm going to get you to close with a program announcement. This new opportunity because of COVID. A new program initiative that is available to Indigenous communities, organizations, and businesses to get engaged. So, folks, I'm just looking at the. There was a question, and the very first question came from. I don't have it here now, but I remember it's from Jerry up in Nunavut. Jerry, you're the first, and he said, "Who else is on this call?" So I think there's just over 100 people, or 95, almost 100 participants on this call. And we'll get you a profile of the breakdown of Indigenous nonprofits, businesses, organizations. We can get a profile and we can send it out to all of you to say, here's who participated. But I don't have that right at my fingertips, Jerry, but we'll get that information for you. But thanks for that question. The very first question coming from Nunavut. Great to have you on board, man. There's a question about our organizations that are not registered, are not for profits eligible to apply. The answer is yes. So industry can apply, nonprofits can apply, academia, public sector. It's an open and inclusive process. There was another question, and I don't wait. Here we go. Here's a question. We have 6 students currently working in a Mitacs BSI, 2 with Indigenous organizations, 1 nonprofit, and 1 for private. Both of these organizations would like to put in proposals for new Indigenous BSI initiatives. Would they be eligible? The answer is yes, and the answer is wait for Candace now to tell you about the new initiative. Here's a question. Is anyone looking into water shortage problems on the reservation that are in extreme need that the government's ignoring? Question from Joseph. Joseph, the answer is yes. There's been past projects that I've seen that Mitacs funded that not only looked at wastewater and water shortages, they looked at what are the systems that could be developed for regenerating water supplies, better wastewater treatment plants. They were looking at microorganisms that could break down sewage and these types of things. This is there, and like you said, some of this research, of course, was done for mainstream communities, and we're saying, let's get these done for Indigenous communities. Some of the issues are the same. It's about water management, and Andrea, you spoke to that. So what you'll be able to learn by connecting with a Mitacs rep, you'll be able to see the types of things that have been done under the water agenda. And then, of course, as you heard, it's about listening to you folks to see what are your issues and needs and how a research project could be crafted and designed for you. So water's critical, it's important, and there has been quite a lot of experience here. Yeah, there he is, Jerry Ward from Kukwatjalak Corporation in Iqaluit. I hear it's really cold up there today, Jerry, minus 38 with the wind chill, so hang in there. Let's see. We've got, in terms of the scope of this initiative and the size of projects, are there minimum and maximum requirements in terms of funding and the length of the project? So I'm going to defer that question to Candace when I turn to Candace to outline the program. The answer is it's flexible. You can actually have short research projects. You can have longer ones. You can have one researcher, you could have multiple. So it really depends on the size, the scope, and the nature of the work. I mean, look what Andrea did. They started with her, and now she's expanding it. She's bringing on people. So these things are sort of a work in process, and I'll get Candace to elaborate on that a bit more. So folks, if you've got, again, even, oh, here we go. Andrea, here's a question. What challenges do you anticipate as an Indigenous researcher as you start your academic career, especially when you think about your partnerships with Indigenous communities?
That's a fantastic question and something I spend a lot of time thinking about for sure. And I guess I'd just like to say first and foremost that I don't pretend to speak for all Indigenous scholars in any way, shape, or form. I'm someone who, because of the residential school system and the 60s scoop, I grew up outside of community, and I'm white coated. And so that means that I move through academic hallways probably in a very different way than some of my close colleagues and friends do. But there are certainly a lot of challenges in terms of engaging in Indigenous research methodologies in the academy. And so there's some big hurdles to contend, but I am very willing to take up those battles. I mean, a really key piece of a lot of this work is intellectual property and making sure that communities retain control over the knowledge that they're sharing, over the work that they're doing. And fortunately, the space that I'm walking into at UBC, we have a great group, the Indigenous Research Support Initiative, IRSI, that's already doing so much of this good work to create really amazing research agreements, these templates that we can take to community that have tons of language in them around UNDRIP and fundamental rights of these communities, around OCAP, around intellectual property protection and all those kinds of things. So I feel like I have some strong allies in this work, but that's certainly a major challenge for sure. I think that there's a lot of work to be done, and I'm really excited that there's a growing number of Indigenous scholars working in this space. And I'm working together with folks across the country, people like Dr. Jessie Pop at Guelph and Dr. Deb McGregor at York, and a number of other wonderful people working in these kind of two-eyed seeing or two-row wampum or multiple ways of knowing kinds of spaces, and leaning on each other to create a network of support, because the challenges are large and there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but we're working together to navigate them better together.
Tremendous, thank you. There's a question here, and actually there's one question about the webinar itself. It is being recorded and we will share it with people so that you can share it with others in your networks. There's a question about, ways in which different Indigenous interests and projects have been, helping around development and conservation. So, I mean, there's been an example where Catsie First Nation did some work in BC around water conservation. In Ontario, they actually did work around oil sands with, I think it was Fort Mackay First Nation, around oil sands extractions and so on. So Candace, can you give just a quick few more examples of other types of projects that have been more focused around development and conservation per se?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you gave some great examples, but it can be from such far-reaching spectrums, from projects like Andrea's with the First Nations Fisheries Fund, or working with the Yukon Mining Consortium in revegetation and incorporating traditional Indigenous ecological ways of knowing into the growing process, and looking at the Three Sisters model of growing and working with the Nataniakdan elders to ensure that they're creating solutions in the North for the North by the North, and I think that's what's really key, is there's a regionality to these projects, and there's such a far-reaching types of examples that I could use, that it's hard to just narrow it down to a few. But if a community has any sort of needs in terms of conservation, we're happy to work with them. We've worked on so many different projects. I think of the Smart Ice project, right? And really looking at the Arctic, and I have a permafrost project as well, right? Looking at the degradation in the Arctic again. So it really is a coast to coast to coast, all of Canada, whatever conservation needs there may be, that could be a Mitacs project. If you can't Google an answer, that's a Mitacs project.
There's a really cool example, think about the Arctic, Siku, S-I-K-U, and it shows an Inuk hunter with a cell phone, and he's monitoring ice flows with his cell phone, plus with his traditional knowledge for thousands of years. So it's about how to use traditional knowledge, the melting and the waterways and that we all hear and see on the news, and then using technology. It's a great example, and the that whole ice project was phenomenal. I'm going to go to one more question. I'm going to give this to Chris, and then I'm going to ask Candace to close with a description of this new program opportunity. So Chris, the question is, Carl says, I study senior leadership. What's a good approach to better understand Indigenous leadership? And I mean, Carl, you're asking the professor of partnerships and leadership, Chris Gugu. He'll be able to give you some insights on that.
Well, first of all, definitely, I don't consider myself an expert in leadership. Definitely just practice it, I guess. But I think when we look at leadership, and I've had to reflect on my own life numerous times over the years, and especially how Ulnooweg has grown, and even the recent announcement of our partnership with MasterCard by bringing on board another youthful team in their mid-20s, and reflecting back when I started here at Ulnooweg back in 2000. So I'm in my 21st year now at that age, and how I gained kind of the leadership skills that I was able to here at the organization. And it's really all about exposure, being able to have the advantages that I did, exposed to different I don't want to say different cultures, but different Indigenous groups, the First Nations, the Inuit, the Innu, the Métis, and really learning about the history, just building those relationships across Canada. And I didn't learn the history in the textbooks, right? I actually listened to people and built friendships along with those people, and how their communities rose up, and how they lived, I guess, were brought up, and connecting to how they grew up personally, and their influences, their uncles, aunts, their parents. And But I think one of the things I think we value as leaders is that I think especially in today's world, and this is a new generation, I think it's really even notched it up a level, is that we're more intact now, I think, with ensuring that we actually do have a future for our people. And when we're talking about our people, it's not just us as Indigenous people, but all our relations are normal, that all peoples and all species have a future. And I think that's difference in for us as leaders is that we have empathy over everything, right? And you mentioned about reciprocity between our peoples, but it's more than that because it's reciprocity between all species. We've done a terrible job at that. And it's you know, the conciliation that needs to occur between our peoples and the human species leads to kind of the reconciliation process that needs to occur with Mother Nature. And I think the new leaders coming on and the next generation coming up, that's where their focus is on. And you can see how you could see how they're very rooted into their culture at a very young age. And I had to reflect on this myself, is when growing up, I'm lucky to be fluent. I grew up with a father and mother that taught me my culture in terms of being able to hunt. A lot of people don't know that. You know, I grew up knowing how to hunt, knowing how to snare rabbits, knowing how to fish, you know, being able to survive off the land. And we didn't use the terms two-eyed seeing back then. My father he's an elder now, 81, 82, but we didn't use the two-eyed seeing. We use the term Nedugalimk a lot now, right? In terms of sharing the bounty of the earth and equitably. He said it one day, and he's probably spoken it a number of times throughout my life, but I didn't pay attention to it until now. Nedugalimwetwen, that's how he says it, right? And so when I look back, it's like taking it for granted at the time. And it's something very special. Mm-hmm. And now I'm just really learning that. These youth now, probably more in the age of what Candice is, they're very rooted. They're very empowered by their culture and by their connection to Mother Earth. That's totally different than what we were. And I think that's different from non-Indigenous leadership, where those qualities aren't valued in the same sense. And so that's how I've kind of hoping to build on as well for this next generation, that they stay rooted in those values.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. You know, folks, as we come to a close here, there's some more questions. Jim, you've asked a question about a greenhouse operation and where you'd like to go with that, and is that eligible? So here's the answer, folks. Some of you are probably getting ideas, and you're thinking of, okay, where, and you know, what's the probability, or how would I be able to move this idea forward? So we're going to provide you with a copy of this webinar, which you will be able to share. We'll provide you with contact information. Two immediate people are Candace Loring and Chris McLeod, and you can email them. You can email them this afternoon. Candace is at cloring, and that's LORING at mitacs.ca. And Chris McLeod is cmcleod, and that's MCLEOD at mitacs.ca. So Candace, if you could take just 2 minutes and describe the new opportunity that is being made available, that's a very fortuitous opportunity right now, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So Mitacs is showing its commitment to working with Indigenous peoples by creating equitable access to Mitacs Accelerate and business strategy internship programs. One of the biggest barriers that we've discovered for organizations and academics to access Mitacs programming is the financial barrier of the partner contribution. Mitacs will be addressing this by offering an Indigenous call with discounted internships. So from December 1st until January 29th of 2021, Mitacs will be offering a 3-to-1 match. We'll be covering 75% of the cost for these internships, and this will be for both the Accelerate and the BSI internships. And they will qualify if the partner organization is Indigenous, whether it's a for-profit or an eligible not-for-profit organization, or if the student intern who's working on the project self-identifies as Indigenous. But this truly is the biggest discount that Mitacs has ever offered within our history of over 20 years. So we had something very similar at the beginning of COVID-19 with a small to medium enterprise discount, but it was limited to 1 internship per student. We are not limiting these internships. I see a question in the box about size of projects. You're absolutely right. A project can be anywhere from 1 internship to as big as you can dream a project. We have a project that was submitted this year that was over 450 internships. So these can be multi-year projects working with communities, but supporting community needs. I can't stress enough that it's an innovation pull model. We're not here to push a research agenda. The communities, the Indigenous organizations, the businesses, they define the scope of the research. And a really unique opportunity with the business strategy internship. When we look at R&D, we can really focus on that developmental side of things. So I've had the opportunity to work with Indigenous businesses and help them pivot through COVID-19, such as creating online platforms and working with design students, for example, at Capilano University, helping that business get online so that they weren't crippled with the global pandemic that has affected so many of us. But absolutely, if you think that there could be an opportunity, reach out to us. We're happy to have any questions you may have. And I always just like meeting other people too. So just send me a message and let's say hi. But thank you so much. And my hands up to the panelists. I sat here today just in awe of the incredible work that you're doing.
Folks, we're going to bring this to a close, and thank you. Chris, have my eagle feather here as I'm talking and facilitating and learning from you folks today. And folks, what you learned today, an eagle feather and a Mi'kmaq basket have gone up into space. Pretty amazing stuff, folks. And I think, just to sort of recap, you see the potential of where you can go with Andrea's project in the fisheries. And Andrea, I'm always remembered by this one elder when we were dealing with a mining company, and the elder at one point said, yes, we need jobs, and yes, we need economy, but are you going to take care of my brothers and sisters, the fishes, the plants, the water? And the room was paralyzed. And again, I think, Candice, you talked about the holistic approaches and some of the social humanity things that do link back to economy and well-being. And Chris, your examples of the leading edge stuff that you guys are doing and where this research trajectory can go. And you just heard the big sale, folks. Government is looking for stimulus everywhere. We have to stimulate our economies. Mitacs being the recipient of this funding is again, a golden opportunity for us to give student researchers a great opportunity. It can mobilize and advance some of our issues and challenges ahead. And as Sitting Bull said, let's put our heads together to see what we can do for all of our children. That's inclusion. I think that many of the things, there's Sitting Bull, many of the things that we can do can benefit all of our children. So hands up and thank you to Andrea, Chris, and Candice. Thank you for a tremendous job. Thank you folks for joining us. Stay safe and have a very Merry Christmas, and we'll see you all in the new year. Make witch.